All right, this is part two of the 1934 alleged coup to remove FDR as president, and just how real this whole thing really was. And I'll go through Wall Street and FDR by Anthony C. Sutton. I'll go through this, and then I'll get to Maverick Marine by Hans Schmidt, which deals with this 34 coup with Smedley Butler, I guess at this time, the former Brigadier General, Marine General. And you can read about him also in Old Gimlet Eye, which was based on, I believe, interviews between Butler and, I forget the character, Norman, escapes me now, who was an interviewer of sorts. And we'll find out that later. But anyway, even if you do a search on Butler, you'll hit a whole bunch of works, some by him, some that are collations of letters. I think I have one over here. I don't know, letters from a Leatherneck or something like that anyway, which I might get to, because in those letters, he really tees off on the corporations for which he said he made certain foreign countries safe. He really gets into it there. That's why it's ridiculous to think Butler would do anything on behalf of corporate interests, whether you want to call them Wall Street financiers, bankers, industrialists. It doesn't matter. They're all in the same club. And to think that he would do anything domestically on their behalf, I think, is ludicrous. All right, here we go. This is from Wall Street and FDR, just a small section here. They're going to talk about the NRA, which is the National Recovery Administration, which, and I guess rightfully so, a lot of small business people felt, and a lot of politicians felt, was so heavy-handed in favor of big business that it was almost an embarrassment. And that and the Swopes plant, which I'm not going to get into here, and you can read about it. It was I guess not well liked to the point where they just really couldn't float it by the folks. But anyway, here we go. The link between Bernard Baruch and NRA planning has been recorded by Charles Roos in his definitive volume on NRA. Early in March 1933, Johnson and Baruch started on a hunting trip and en route stopped in Washington. Moley had dinner with them and proposed that Johnson remain in Washington to draft a plan for industrial recovery. The idea appealed to Baruch, and he promptly granted Johnson leave of absence from his regular duties. Then Johnson and Moley, after some study of the various proposals believed by the latter to have merit, proceeded to draw up a bill which would organize industry in an attack on the Depression. And this comes from Charles F. Ross's NRA Economic Planning, 1937. All right, now on to the narrative. According to Roos, Johnson's first NRA draft was on 2 sheets of foolscap paper and provided simply for suspension of the antitrust laws, together with almost unlimited authority for President Roosevelt to do almost anything he wished with the economy, including licensing and control of industry. Does this sound vaguely familiar today? According to Roos, quote, it was, of course, rejected by the administration, since it would have made the president a dictator and such power was not desired, end of quote. The seemingly incidental rejection of unwanted dictatorial power by the Roosevelt administration may be of some significance. In Chapter 10, we will describe the Butler affair, an attempt by the same Wall Street interest to install Roosevelt as a dictator or replace him with a more pliant figurehead in case of his objection. Now, that's a little different spin that you'll hear on what the coup was about. Johnson's first draft attempts were to set up NRA in a form consistent with Roosevelt as an economic dictator, and its rejection by Roosevelt is consistent with serious charges laid at the feet of Wall Street. At this point in the planning, according to Roos, Johnson and Moley were joined by Tugwell and later by Donald R. Richburg, a Chicago labor attorney. The three proceeded to draft a more comprehensive bill, whatever that meant. And that was Sutton's comments, not mine. George U. Johnson was appointed head of the National Recovery Administration, created under the title of the NIRA. and I think that was National Industrial Recovery Act, and believed for a while that he was also to head the Public Works Administration. The plans and diagrams drawn up by General Johnson and Alexander Sachs of Lehman Brothers assumed that the NRA head would also direct the Public Works program. Consequently, we can find the roots of the NRA bill and the Public Works Administration in this small Wall Street group. Their effort reflects both the Swope and the Baruch plans for corporate socialism, with an initial attempt to provide for a corporate dictatorship in the United States. On to Chapter 10, entitled FDR, Man on the White Horse. And it starts with an epigraph, which is, I guess, a comment from John W. McCormick, Chairman, Special Committee on Un-American Activities, House of Representatives, February 15, 1935. In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. This committee received evidence from Major General Smedley D. Butler, retired, twice decorated by the Congress of the United States. Your committee was able to verify all the pertinent statements made by General Butler. And that's the end of the opening epigraph for Chapter 10. It says, just before Christmas 1934, news of a bizarre plot to install a dictator in the White House surfaced in Washington and New York, and the story, one of unparalleled significance, was promptly smothered by Congress and the establishment press. On November 21, 1934, the New York Times printed the first portion of the Butler story as told to the House Un-American Activities Committee, giving it front-page treatment and an intriguing lead paragraph. And here it is. It's a block quote. A plot of Wall Street interests to overthrow President Roosevelt and establish a fascist dictatorship backed by a private army of 500,000 ex-soldiers and others was charged by Major General Smedley D. Butler, retired Marine Corps officer. That's the end of the block quote. The New York Times report added that General Butler, quote, had told friends that General U.S. Johnson, former NRA administrator, was scheduled for the role of dictator, and J.P. Morgan and Company, as well as Murphy and Company, were behind the plot. After this promising opening, the New York Times reporting gradually faded away and finally disappeared. Fortunately, enough information has since surfaced to demonstrate that the Butler affair, or the plot to seize the White House, is an integral part of our story of FDR and Wall Street. And now for this subhead, Grayson M.P. Murphy Company, 52 Broadway. And M.P. There's a hyphen between both, so that's how that name presents itself. You'll see it as Gray, M-P, period, actually, Murphy. The central figure in the plot was Major General Smedley Darlington Butler, a colorful, popular, widely known Marine Corps officer, twice decorated with the Congressional Medal of Honor, and a veteran of 33 years of military service. General Butler testified in 1934 to the McCormick-Dickstein Committee investigating Nazi and communist activities in the United States that a plan for a White House dictatorship was outlined to him by two members of the American Legion, Gerald C. McGuire, who worked for Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company, 52 Broadway, New York City, and Bill Doyle, whom Butler identified as an officer of the American Legion. General Butler testified that these men wanted to, quote, unseat the royal family in control of the American Legion at the convention to be held in Chicago and were very anxious to have me take part in it, end of quote. A scheme was outlined to General Butler. He was to come before the convention as a Legion delegate from Honolulu. There would be 200 or 300 American Legion members in the audience, and, quote, these planted fellows were to begin to cheer and start a stampede and yell for a speech. Then I was to go to the platform and make a speech. End of a quote. And there is a very extensive end note here, and I'll go along with it. It starts on the previous page, but I think it bears reading. One site that was used in this also was the opening paragraph, just before Christmas, 1934, blah, blah, blah. That's from Jules Archer's book, The Plot to Seize the White House. Archer's book is, quote, the first effort to tell the whole story of the plot and sequence in full detail, end of quote. It's somewhat knocked, not necessarily, knocked is a strong word. but it's not a book that has or is full of original work, and therefore not something necessarily new, but perhaps laid out in a certain kind of continuum that was comprehensive. Now, this other endnote says, it said also see George Wolfskill, The Revolt of the Conservatives, 1962, which has extensive material on the plot. The interested readers should also take a look at George Seldes, that's spelled S-E-L-D-E-S, 1,000 Americans, 1947. Unfortunately, while these books have kept the event alive, a valiant effort that should by no means be underrated, they do reflect an amateurish confusion of fascism with moderation. Supporters of the Constitution would, of course, absolutely reject the dictatorial efforts described. Some groups, such as the American Conservative Union, for instance, have for a decade aimed their attacks at the targets identified by Archer and Seldes. The misinterpretation by the latter authors is accentuated because confusion over the meaning of conservatism also prevented these authors from exploring the possibility that Wall Street had none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt in mind as the man on the white horse. All right, moving on to the prepared speech was to be written by Morgan associate John W. Davis. To prove his Wall Street financial backing, McGuire showed General Butler a bank book listing deposits of $42,000 and $64,000 and mentioned that their source was Grayson and P. Murphy, director of Guarantee Trust Company and other Morgan-controlled companies. A millionaire banker, Robert S. Clark, with offices in the Stock Exchange building in 11 Wall Street, was also involved. Robert Clark was incidentally known to Gerald Butler from his China campaign days. McGuire and Doyle also offered Butler a substantial sum to make a similar speech before the Convention of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, at Miami Beach. According to McGuire, his group had investigated the background of Mussolini and Italian fascism, Hitler's organization in Germany, and the Croix de Feu in France, and hinted that it was time to establish a similar organization in the United States. General Butler testified to the Congressional Committee about McGuire's statement in the following words. This is a block quote. He said, quote, "The time has come now to get the soldiers ready." "Yes," I said, "I think so too." He said, I went abroad to study the part that the veterans play in the various setups of the governments that they have abroad. I went to Italy for 2 or 3 months and studied the position that the veterans of Italy occupy in the fascist setup of government, and I discovered that they are the background of Mussolini. They keep them on the payrolls in various ways and keep them contented and happy, and they are his real backbone, the force on which he may depend in case of trouble to sustain him. But that setup would not suit us at all. The soldiers of America would not like that. I then went to Germany to see what Hitler was doing, and his whole strength lies in organizations of soldiers too. But that would not do. I looked into the Russian business. I found that the use of the soldiers over there would never appeal to our men. Then I went to France and I found just exactly the organization we are going to have. It is an organization of super soldiers. Butler continues, he gave me the French name for it, but I do not recall what it is. I never could have pronounced it anyway. But I do know that it's a super organization of members of all other soldiers' organizations of France, composed of non-commissioned officers and officers. He told me that they had about 500,000 and that each one was a leader of 10 others, so that it gave them 5 million votes. And he said, quote, "Now, that is our idea here in America, to get up an organization of that kind," end of quote. This is in the New York Times, November 21st, 1934. Moving on. What would be the objective of this super organization? According to the previously cited New York Times, General Butler is reported to have testified that the affair was an attempted coup d'etat to overthrow President Roosevelt and replace him with a fascist dictator. Like Roosevelt didn't turn out to be a dictator? Not that he wanted to, but that's what they made him. And so they got what they wanted anyway. And that's my 2 cents. Okay. Moving on. This interpretation is reported by Archer, Seldes, and other writers. Now, this is where it gets good. However, this was not the accusation made by General Butler to the committee. Butler's precise statement concerning the projected organization, the use to which it was to be put when established, and the role of President Roosevelt is as follows. General Butler reported on his conversation with McGuire. All right, and the transcript continues here with Butler being the person who says, I said. I said, what do you want to do with it when you get it up? Well, he said, we want to support the president. I said, the president does not need the support of that kind of an organization. Since when did you become a supporter of the president? The last time I talked to you, you were against him. He said, well, he is going to go along with us now. Is he? Yes. Well, what are you going to do with these men? Suppose you get these 500,000 men in America. What are you going to do with them? Well, he said, they will be the support of the president. I said, the president has got the whole American people. Why does he want them? Meaning the soldiers. He said, don't you understand the setup has to be changed a bit. Now we have got him, we have got the president. He has got to have more money. There is not any more money to give him. 80% of the money now is in government bonds, and he cannot keep his racket up much longer. He has got to do something about it. He has either got to get more money out of us, or he has got to change the method of financing the government. And we are going to see that he does not change that method. He will not change it. I said, this idea of this great group of soldiers, then, is to sort of frighten him, is it? No, not to frighten him. This is to sustain him when others assault him. I said, well, I don't know about that. How would the president explain it? He said, he will not necessarily have to explain it because we are going to help him out. Now, did it ever occur to you that the president is overworked? We might have an assistant president, somebody to take the blame, and if things do not work out, he can drop him. He went on to say that it did not take any constitutional change to authorize another cabinet official, somebody to take over the details of the office, take them off the president's shoulders. He mentioned that the position would be a Secretary of General Affairs, a sort of super secretary. All right, now Chairman McCormick asks, a Secretary of General Affairs? Butler. That is the term used by him, or a Secretary of General Welfare. I cannot recall which. I came out of the interview with that name in my head. I got that idea from talking to both of them. They had both talked about the same kind of relief that ought to be given the president, and he said, you know, the American people will swallow that. We have got the newspapers. We can start a campaign that the president's health is failing. Everybody can tell that by looking at him, and the dumb American people will fall for it in a second. And that's the end of a quote, and Butler said, and I could see it. They had that sympathy racket that they were going to have somebody take the patronage off of his soldiers. I'm sorry, let me repeat that. Going to have somebody take the patronage off of his shoulders and take all the worries and details off of his shoulders. And then he will be like the president of France. And I said, so that is where you got this idea? He said, I have been traveling around, looking around. Now, about this super organization, would you be interested in heading it? I said, I am interested in it, but I do not know about heading it. I am very greatly interested in it because, you know, Jerry, my one hobby is maintaining a democracy. If you get these 500,000 soldiers advocating anything smelling of fascism, I am going to get 500,000 more and lick the hell out of you. I will have a real war right at home. You know that? Oh, no, we don't want that. We want to ease up on the president. Yes, and then you will put somebody in there you can run. Is that the idea? The president will go around and christen babies and dedicate bridges and kiss children? Mr. Roosevelt will never agree to that himself. Oh, yes, he will. Yeah, he will agree to that. And that's the transcript, part of the transcript from the investigation of Nazi propaganda activities and investigation of certain other propaganda activities, hearings number 73. Moving on to the narrative, Sutton writes, in other words, the Wall Street plot was not to dispose of President Roosevelt at all, but to kick him upstairs and install an assistant president with absolute powers. Just why was it necessary to go to the trouble of installing an assistant president is unclear because the vice president was in office. In any event, it was planned to run the United States with a Secretary of General Affairs, and the gullible American people would take this under the guise of necessary protection from a communist takeover. At this point, it is interesting to recall the role of many of these same financiers and financial firms in the Bolshevik Revolution, a role, incidentally, that could not have been known to General Butler, and the use of similar Red Scare tactics in the 1922 United Americans organization. Grayson M.P. Murphy was, in the early 30s, a director of several companies controlled by the J.P. Morgan interests, including the New York Trust Company, and Bethlehem Steel, and was on the board of Inspiration Copper Company, National Aviation Corporation, Intercontinental Rubber Company, and U.S. and Foreign Securities. John W. Davis, the speechwriter for General Butler, was a partner in Davis, Polk, Wardwell, Gardner, and Reed of 15 Broad Street, which is in that same Wall Street neighborhood. Both Polk and Wardwell of this prestigious law firm, as well as Grayson Murphy, had roles in the Bolshevik Revolution. Further, Davis was also a co-director with Murphy in the Morgan Control Guarantee Trust Company and a co-director with presidential hopeful Al Smith in the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, as well as the director of the Mutual Life Insurance Company, the U.S. Rubber Company, and American Telephone and Telegraph, the controlling unit of the Bell system. Fortunately for history, General Butler discussed the offer with an impartial newspaper source at a very early point in his talks with McGuire and Doyle. The McCormick-Dick-Steen Committee heard testimony under oath from this confidant, Paul Comely French. French confirmed the facts that he was a reporter for the Philadelphia Record and the New York Evening Post, and that General Butler had told him about the plot in September of 1934. Subsequently, on September 13, 1934, French went to New York and met with McGuire. The following is part of French's statement to the committee. All right, and this is from French. I saw Gerald P. McGuire in the offices of Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company, the 12th floor of 52 Broadway, shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He has a small private office there, and I went into his office. I have here some direct quotes from him. As soon as I left his office, I got to a typewriter and made a memorandum of everything that he told me. We need a fascist government in this country, he insisted, to save the nation from the communists who want to tear it down and wreck all that we have built in America. The only men who have the patriotism to do it are the soldiers, and Smedley Butler is the ideal leader. He could organize 1 million men overnight. During the conversation, he told me he had been in Italy and Germany during the summer of 1934 and the spring of 1934. And had made an intensive study of the background of the Nazi and fascist movements and how the veterans had played a part in them. He said he had obtained enough information on the fascist and Nazi movements and of the part played by the veterans to properly set up one in this country. He emphasized throughout this conversation with me that the whole thing was tremendously patriotic, that it was saving the nation from communists, and that the men they deal with have that crack-brained idea that the communists are going to take it apart. He said the only safeguard would be the soldiers. At first he suggested that the general organize this outfit himself and ask $1 a year dues from everybody. We discussed that, and then he came around to the point of getting outside financial funds, and he said that it would not be any trouble to raise $1 million. During the course of the conversation, he continually discussed the need of a man on a white horse, as he called it, a dictator who would come galloping in on his white horse. He said that was the only way, either through the threat of armed force or the delegation of power and the use of a group of organized veterans, to save the capitalistic system. He warmed up considerably after we got underway, and he said, we might go along with Roosevelt and then do with him what Mussolini did with the King of Italy. It fits in with what he told the general, and that would be Butler, that we would have a Secretary of General Affairs, and if Roosevelt played ball, swell, and if he did not, they would push him out. And that came again from that same House of Representatives investigation of Nazi propaganda, blah, blah, blah. All right? Now, if this individual is to be believed, and apparently he was very credible, you got McGuire saying a number of things to a number of people. So he's got basically more than one face, let's just say. And he is a questionable character, as you'll come out to find. So anyway, on another subhead in this chapter 10, Jackson Martindale, 14 Wall Street. The sworn testimony of General Smedley Butler and Paul French in the committee hearings has a persistent thread. General Butler rambled from time to time, and some parts of his statements are vague, but there is obviously a lot to the story, more to the story than an innocent gathering of American Legion members into a super organization. Is there any independent evidence to confirm General Butler and Paul French? Unknown to both Butler and French, Guarantee Trust had been involved in Wall Street maneuverings in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, so indicating at least a predisposition to mix financial business with dictatorial politics. Two of the persons involved in the plot were directors of Guarantee Trust. Also, before the hearings were abruptly halted, the committee heard evidence from an independent source which confirmed many details recounted by General Butler and Paul French. In December 1934, Captain Samuel Glazier, commanding officer of the CCC camp at Elk Ridge, Maryland, was called before the committee. On October 2, 1934, testified Captain Glazier he had received a letter from A.P. Sullivan, Assistant Adjutant General of the U.S. Army, introducing a Mr. Jackson Martindale, who will be shown every courtesy by you. This letter was sent to Glazier by command of Major General Malone of the U.S. Army. Who was Jackson Martindale? He was a financial counsel with offices at 14 Wall Street, previously associated with Stone and Webster and Blodgett, Incorporated, investment bankers of 120 Broadway, and with Carter, Martindale and Company, investment bankers at 115 Broadway. Martindale was a man of substance, living according to the New York Times in the center of a beautiful 60-acre estate they had bought from Charles Pfizer, and was sufficiently influential for General Malone to arrange a conducted tour of the Elk Ridge, Maryland Conservation Corps camp. Martindale's association with Stone and Webster, 120 Broadway, is significant and by itself warrants a follow-up on his associates in the Wall Street area. Captain Glazier provided Martindale with a requested camp tour and testified to the committee that Martindale posted numerous questions about a similar camp for men to work in industry rather than in forests. A week or so after the visit, Captain Glazier visited Martindale's New Jersey home, learned that he was a personal friend of General Malone, and was informed that Martindale wanted to organize camps similar to the CCC to train 500,000 young men. The overtones of this talk, as reported by Glazier, were anti-Semitic and suggested an attempted coup d'etat in the United States. The organization sponsoring this overthrow was called American Vigilantes, whose emblem was a flag with a red eagle on a blue background in lieu of the German swastika. This was in part an independent verification of General Butler's testimony. Gerald C. McGuire's testimony. Gerald McGuire, one of the accused plotters, was called before the committee and testified at length under oath. He stated that he met General Butler in 1933 and that his reasons for visiting Butler were, 1, to discuss the Committee for a Sound Dollar. That was an organization, the Committee for a Sound Dollar. And 2, that he thought Butler would be, quote, a fine man to be commander of the Legion. McGuire admitted that he told General Butler that he was a member of the Distinguished Guest Committee of the American Legion. He had a hazy recollection that millionaire Robert S. Clark had talked to Butler, but denied emphatically making arrangements for Clark to meet Butler. McGuire admitted sending Butler postcards from Europe, that he had a conversation with the general at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, and that he had told Butler that he was going to the convention in Miami. However, when asked whether he had told Butler about the role veterans played in European governments, he replied that he had not, although he stated that he told Butler that in his opinion, and this is a quote, Hitler would not last another year in Germany and that Mussolini was on the skids, end of quote. McGuire's testimony on his meeting with French differed substantially from French's account. The question posed by the committee, which we'll just call question. Now, what did Mr. French call to see you about, Mr. McGuire? He called, according to Mr. French's story, to meet me and to make my acquaintance because I had known General Butler and I was a friend of his and he wanted to know me, and that was mainly the object of his visit. Question. Nothing else discussed? A number of things discussed, yes. The position of the bond market, the stock market, what I thought was a good buy right now, what he could buy if he had $700 or $800, the position of the country, the prospects for recovery, and various topics that any two men would discuss if they came together. Question. Nothing else? Nothing else excepting this, Mr. Chairman. As I had said yesterday, I believe when Mr. French came to me, he said, General Butler is, or has, again been approached by 2 or 3 organizations, and I think he mentioned one of them as the Vigilante Committee of this country. And he said, what do you think of it? And I think I said to him, well, I don't know the general ought to get mixed up with any of those affairs in this country. I think these fellows are all trying to use him, to use his name for publicity purposes and to get membership. And I think he ought to keep away from any of these organizations. Question. Nothing else? Nothing else. That was the gist of the entire conversation. McGuire had further testified that he worked for Grayson Murphy and that Robert S. Clark had put up $300,000 to form the Committee for a Sound Dollar. The McCormick-Dickstein Committee was able to confirm the fact that Robert Sterling Clark transmitted money to McGuire for political purposes. And this is from a press release, and these are block quotes. He, meaning McGuire, further testified that this money was given him by Mr. Clark long after the Chicago Convention of the Legion, and they had also received from Walter E. Frew of the Corn Exchange Bank and Trust Company the sum of $1,000, which was also placed to the credit of the Sound Money Committee. McGuire then testified that he had received from Robert Sterling Clark approximately $7,200 for his traveling expenses to, in, and from Europe, to which he had been added the sum of $2,500 on another occasion and $1,000 at another time, and he stated under oath that he had not received anything from anybody else, and further testified he had deposited it in his personal account at the Manufacturers Trust Company, 55 Broad Street. McGuire further testified that he had a drawing account of $432 a month right now, to which were added some commissions. Later, McGuire testified that the $2,500, and the $1,000 were in connection with the organization of the Committee for a Sound Dollar. Chairman McCormick then directed the following question, quote, "Did Mr. Clark contribute any money in any other way besides the $30,000 and the other sums that you have enumerated he gave to you personally?" End of quote. To which McGuire replied, and this is a quote, "No, sir, he has been asked several times to contribute to different funds, but he has refused." All right, back to Sutton. In its New York press release, the committee noted several discrepancies in McGuire's testimony on receipt of funds. This section reads as follows, and this is the block quote. Neither could McGuire remember what the purpose of his trip was to Washington or whether he had given the Central Hanover Bank 13 $1,000 bills or that he bought one of the letters of credit with a certified check drawn on the account of Mr. Christmas. In the course of the questioning, McGuire could not remember whether he had even ever handled $1,000 bills, and certainly could not remember producing 13 of them at one time in the bank. It must be remembered in this connection that the $13,000 purchase with $1,000 bills at the bank came just 6 days after Butler claims McGuire showed him 18 $1,000 bills in Newark. From the foregoing, it can readily be seen that in addition to the $30,000 which Clark gave McGuire for the Sound Money Committee, that he produced approximately $75,000 more, which McGuire reluctantly admitted on being confronted with the evidence. The $75,000 is shown in the $26,000 that went into the manufacturer's trust account, $10,000 in currency at the luncheon, the purchase of letters of credit totaling $30,300, of which Christmas's certified check was represented as $15,000, expenses to Europe close to $8,000. This still stands unexplained. Whether there was more and how much, the committee does not yet know. Back to Sutton. The committee then asked McGuire an obvious question, whether he knew Jackson Martindale. Unfortunately, an equally obvious error in McGuire's answer was allowed to pass by unchallenged. The committee transcript read as follows. By the chairman. Question. Do you know Mr. Martindale, Mr. McGuire? Mr. Martindale? No, sir, I do not. The chairman. Is that his name? Mr. Dickstein. I think so. Someone brief, and this is back to Sutton. We have three reliable witnesses, General Butler, Paul French, and Captain Samuel Glazier, testifying under oath about plans of a plot to install a dictatorship in the United States. And we have contradictory testimony from Gerald McGuire that clearly warrants further investigation. Such investigation was at first the committee's stated intention. Quote, the committee is awaiting the return to this country of both Mr. Clark and Mr. Christmas. As the evidence stands, it calls for an explanation that the committee has been unable to obtain from Mr. McGuire. End of quote. But the committee did not call either Mr. Clark or Mr. Christmas to give evidence. It made no further effort, at least no further effort appears on the public record, to find an explanation for the inconsistencies and inaccuracies in McGuire's testimony that was given to committee under oath. Now, in another subhead, suppression of Wall Street involvement. The story of the attempted takeover of executive power in the United States was suppressed not only by parties directly interested, but also by several institutions usually regarded as protectors of constitutional liberty and freedom of inquiry. Among the groups suppressing information were 1. The Congress of the United States, 2. The press, notably Time, and that's Time magazine, and the New York Times, and 3. The White House itself. Interesting. It is also notable that no academic inquiry has been conducted into what is surely one of the most ominous events in American history. Suppression is even more regrettable in light of the current trend toward collectivism in the United States and the likelihood of another attempt at a dictatorial takeover using supposed threats from either the left or the right as a pretext. Suppression by the House Un-American Activities Committee took the form of deleting extensive excerpts relating to Wall Street financiers, including Guaranty Trust Director Grayson Murphy, J.P. Morgan, the DuPont interests, Remington Arms, and others allegedly involved in the plot. Even today, in 1975, a full transcript of the hearings cannot be traced. Some of the deleted portions of the transcript were unearthed by reporter John Spivak. A reference to NRA Administrator Hugh Johnson will show the type of information suppressed. The committee suppressed the words in italics from the printed testimony. Butler speaks to McGuire. All right, I don't mean to get this tedious, but I'll have to tell you what's italed. Remember, that is what was suppressed from the public testimony, what was given to the public. And here we go. I said, "Is there anything stirring about it yet?" "Yes," he says. "You watch. In 2 or 3 weeks, you will see it come out in the papers. There will be big fellows in it." And this is what was suppressed. And in about 2 weeks, the American Liberty League appeared, which was just about what he described to me. And that's Butler talking about McGuire. All right, back to the public record. We might have an assistant president, somebody to take the blame, and if things do not work out, he can drop him. Suppressed. He said, "That is what we was building up Hugh Johnson for. Hugh Johnson talked too damn much and he got into a hole, and he's going to fire him in the next 3 or 4 weeks." I said, "How do you know all this?" "Oh," he said, we are in with him all the time. We know what is going to happen." All right, end of the suppressed testimony. The testimony of Paul French was also censored by the House Committee. Witness the following extract from French's testimony referring to John W. Davis, J.P. Morgan, the DuPont Company, and others in Wall Street, and which strongly corroborates General Butler's testimony. And we'll tell you when it gets what was suppressed. This was public. At first he, McGuire, suggested that the General, Butler, organize this outfit himself and ask $1 a year dues from everybody. We discussed that, and then he came around to the point of getting outside financial funds, and he said it would not be any trouble to raise $1 million. This is suppressed. He said he could go to John W. Davis, attorney for J.P. Morgan and Company, or Perkins in the National City Bank, and any number of persons to get it. Of course, that may or may not mean anything. That is, his reference to John W. Davis and Perkins in the National City Bank. During my conversation with him, I did not, of course, commit the General to anything. I was just feeling him along. Later, we discussed the question of arms and equipment, and he suggested they could be obtained from the Remington Arms Company on credit through the DuPonts. I do not think at that time he mentioned the connections of DuPont with the American Liberty League, but he skirted all around it. That is, I do not think he mentioned the Liberty League, but he skirted all around the idea that that was the back door. One of the DuPonts is on the board of directors of the American Liberty League, and they own a controlling interest in Remington Arms. He said the General would not have any trouble enlisting 500 men. That's the end of the suppressed testimony. John L. Spivak, the reporter who unearthed the suppression in the congressional transcripts, challenged committee co-chairman Samuel Dickstein of New York with his evidence. Dickstein admitted that, and here's a block quote, "The committee had deleted certain parts of the testimony because they were hearsay. But your published reports are full of hearsay testimony." "They are," he said. Oh, he goes, "They are," he said. Okay, he's questioning this. "Why wasn't Grayson Murphy called? Your committee knew that Murphy's men are in the anti-Semitic espionage organization Order of 76. We didn't have time. We'd have taken care of the Wall Street groups if we had the time. I would have no hesitation in going after the Morgans." Right. "You had Belgrano commander of the American Legion, listed to testify. Why wasn't he examined? I don't know. Maybe you can get Mr. McCormick to explain that. I had nothing to do with it. And that's from the book, A Man in His Time, 1967, author John L. Spivak. And there was an NBC correspondent by the name of Spivak. Got to check out whether that's related or if that's him. I doubt that would be him. He would never be allowed into mainstream media. Anyway, back to the narrative. The fact remains that the committee did not call Grayson Murphy, Jackson Martindale, or John W. Davis, all directly accused in sworn testimony. Further, the committee deleted all portions of the testimony involving other prominent persons, J.B. Morgan, the DuPonts, the Rockefeller interests, Hugh Johnson, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. When Congressman Dickstein pleaded his innocence to John Spivak, it was inconsistent with his own letter to President Roosevelt, in which he claims to have placed restrictions upon even public distribution of the committee hearings as printed, quote, in order that they may not get into other than responsible hands, end of quote. The final report issued by the committee in February 15, 1935, buried the story even further. John L. Spivak sums up the burial succinctly. Quote, I studied the committee's report. It gave 6 pages to the threat by Nazi agents operating in this country and 11 pages to the threat by communists. It gave 1 page to the plot to seize the government and destroy our democratic system. This is also from Spivak's book. The role of leading newspapers and journals of opinion in reporting the Butler affair is equally suspect. In fact, their handling of the event has the appearance of outright distortion and censorship. The veracity of some newspapers has been widely questioned in the last 50 years. And that comes from All the News That Fits by Herman Dinsmore, 1969. And in some quarters, the media have been accused of a conspiracy to suppress everything in opposition to the wishes of the interest served. For example, all right, we'll go into, that's the famous Callaway entry in the Congressional Record about the newspapers being bought out as early as March 1915. And we'll move on. In the Butler affair, the accused interests are also those identified by Congressman Callaway, the J.P. Morgan firm, and the steel and powder industries. General Butler accused Grayson Murphy, a director of the Morgan-controlled Guarantee Trust Company, Jackson Martindale, associated with Stone & Webster, allied to the Morgans, the DuPont Company, the powder industry, and Remington Arms Company, which was controlled by DuPont and the Morgan-Harriman financial interests. Further, the firms that appear in the suppressed 1934 congressional testimony are J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Remington Arms. In brief, if we can verify 1934 congressional suppression of information that supports the earlier 1917 charges of Congressman Callaway, we can verify, I shouldn't say okay. Does such suppression extend to major news journals? We can take 2 prime examples, the New York Times and Time Magazine. If such a combination as Callaway charges did exist, then these 2 journals would certainly be among 25 of the greatest papers involved in the 1930s. The New York Times reporting of the plot opens up with a front-page headline article on November 21, 1934. And this is the quote, General Butler bears fascist plot to seize government by force. That was the headline, with the lead paragraph quoted above, page 143. I will go back to that now. This Times article is a reasonably good job of reporting and includes a forthright statement by Congressman Dickstein. And here's the quote. From present indications, Butler has the evidence. He's not going to make any serious charges unless he has something to back them up. We'll have men here with bigger names than his. That's the end of the quote. Then the Times article records that, quote, Mr. Dickstein said that about 16 persons mentioned by General Butler to the committee would be subpoenaed, and that a public hearing might be held next Monday. End of the quote. The Times also includes outright and sometimes enraged denials from Hugh Johnson, Thomas W. Lamont, and Grayson M.P. Murphy of Guarantee Trust. The following morning, November 22nd, the Times made a major switch in reporting the plot. The disclosures were removed to an inside page, although the testimony now concerned Gerald McGuire, one of the accused plotters. Further, a decided change in the attitude of the committee can be discerned. Congressman McCormick is now reported as saying that, quote, the committee has not decided whether to call any additional witnesses. He said that the most important witness, aside from McGuire, was Robert Sterling Clark, a wealthy New Yorker with offices in the Stock Exchange building. And that's the end of the quote. Back to the narrative. While the Times reporting was consigned to an inside single column, the editorial page, its most influential section, carried a lead editorial that set the tone for subsequent reporting. Under the head, Credulity Unlimited, it contended that the Butler charge was a, quote, bald and unconvincing narrative. The whole story sounds like a gigantic hoax. It does not merit serious discussion, end of quote. In brief, before the 16 important witnesses were called, before the evidence was on the record, before the charge was investigated, the New York Times decided that it wanted to hear nothing about this story because it was a hoax, not fit to print. The next day, November 23rd, the Times changed its reporting still further. The headlines were now about Reds and Red Union strife and concerned alleged activities by communists and American trade unions, while the Butler testimony and the developing evidence was secreted deep within the reporting of Red activities. The resulting story was, of course, vague and confused, but it effectively buried the Butler evidence. On November 26th, the hearings continued, but the committee itself now had cold feet and issued a statement. Quote, this committee has had no evidence before it that would in the slightest degree warrant calling before it such men as John W. Davis, General U. Johnson, General James G. Harbord, Thomas W. Lamont, Admiral William S. Sims, or Hanford McNider. End of quote. It should be noticed that these names had come up in sworn testimony, later to be deleted from the official record. The Times pursued its reporting of this development in abbreviated form on an inside page under the head, Committee calm over Butler plot, has no evidence to warrant calling Johnson and others. On November 27th, the Times reporting declined to 5 column inches on an inside page under the ominous head, Butler plot inquiry not to be dropped. The December hearings were reported by the Times on a front page in December 28, 1934. But the plot was now twisted to, quote, Reds plot to kidnap the president. Witness charges at House inquiry, end of quote. Reviewing the story of the Butler affair in the Times 40 years after the event and comparing its story to the printed official testimony, itself heavily censored, it is obvious that the newspaper, either under its own initiative or under outside pressure, decided that the story was not to be made public. Consistent with this interpretation, we find that the New York Times, the newspaper of record, omits the Butler testimony from entries in its annual index, depended upon by researchers and scholars. The Times Index for 1934 has an entry, quote, Butler, Major General, in parentheses, comma, Smedley D., end of quote. And not that that's dialogue, but that's what appears in that Times Index. But it lists only a few of his speeches and a biographic portrait. The Butler testimony is not listed. There is an entry, see also, Fascism, U.S., but under that cross-reference, there is listed only Major or Maj Gen S.D. Butler charges plot to overthrow present government, semicolon. Wall Street interests and G.P. McGuire implicated at Cong, meaning congressional, Com, meaning committee, hearing. The only significant Wall Street name mentioned in that index is that of R.S. Clark, who was reported as puzzled by the charges. None of the key Morgan and DuPont associates cited by General Butler is listed in the index. In other words, there appears to have been a deliberate attempt by this newspaper to mislead historians. Time magazine's reporting descended to fiction in its attempts to reduce General Butler's evidence to the status of absurdity. If ever a student wants to construct an example of biased reporting, there is a first-rate example in a comparison of the evidence presented to the McCormick-Dickstein Committee by General Butler with the subsequent Time reportage. The December 3rd, 1934 issue of Time, and remember that, December 3rd, 1934, that issue of Time ran the story under the head, Plot Without Plotters. But the story bears no resemblance at all to the testimony, not even the censored testimony. The story portrays General Butler leading 500,000 men along U.S. Highway 1 with the cry, Men, Washington is but 30 miles away. Will you follow me? Butler was then depicted as taking over the U.S. government by force from President Roosevelt. See, this is where this might come from. that Butler was actually into it, instead of just trying to draw the situation out to find out, who the bastards were, more or less. All right, one more time. Butler was then depicted as taking over the U.S. government by force from President Roosevelt. The remainder of the Times story is filled with dredges from Butler's past and an assortment of denials from the accused. Nowhere is there any attempt to report the statements by General Butler, although the denials by J.P. Morgan, Hugh Johnson, Robert Sterling Clark, and Grayson Murphy are cited correctly. 2 photographs are included: a genial, grandfatherly J.P. Morgan and General Butler in a pose that universally symbolizes lunacy, a finger pointed to his ear. The reporting was trashy, dishonest, and disgraceful journalism at its very worst. Whatever your thoughts may be on the Nazi propaganda or Soviet press distortion, neither Goebbels nor Gosselaar ever attained the hypnotic expertise of Times journalism and editors. The fearful problem is that the opinions and mores of millions of Americans and of English speakers around the world have been molded by the school of distorted journalism. To keep our criticism in perspective, it must be noted that Time was apparently impartial in its pursuit of lurid journalism. Even U.S. Johnson, administrator of NRA and one of the alleged plotters in the Butler affair, was a target of Time's mischief, as Johnson reports in his book. And this comes from The Blue Eagle from Egg to Earth by Johnson. I stood in the reviewing stand in that parade, and there were hundreds of people I knew who waved as they went past. Down below were amassed batteries of cameras, and I knew if I raised my hand higher than my shoulders, it would seem and be publicized as a fascist salute. So I never did raise it higher. I just stuck my arm out straight and wiggled my hand around. But that didn't help me. Time came out saying I had constantly saluted all Mussolini and even had a photograph to prove it. But it wasn't my arm on that photograph. It wore the taped cuff sleeve of a cutaway coat and a stiff round cuff with an old-fashioned cuff button, and I never wore either in my whole life. I think it was the arm of Mayor O'Brien, who stood beside me, which had been faked onto my body. So basically, photo doctoring. And lastly, under the subhead, an assessment of the Butler affair. The most important point to be assessed is the credibility of General Smedley Darlington Butler. Was General Butler lying? Was he telling the truth? Was he exaggerating for the sake of effect? General Butler was an unusual man, and a particularly unusual man to find in the armed forces. Decorated twice with the Medal of Honor, an unquestioned leader of men, with undoubted personal bravery, deep loyalty to his fellow men, and a fierce sense of justice. All these are admirable qualities. Certainly, General Butler was hardly the type of man to tell lies or even exaggerate for a petty reason. His flair for the dramatic does leave open a possibility of exaggeration, but deliberate lying is most unlikely. Does the evidence support or reject Butler? Reporter Paul French of the Philadelphia Record wholly supports Butler. Evidence by Captain Glazier, commander of the CCC camp, supports Butler. In these 2 cases, there is no discrepancy in the evidence. The statements of McGuire, made under oath to Congress, do not support Butler. We have, therefore, a conflict of sworn evidence. Further, McGuire was found at fault on several points by the committee. He used the evasion of do not recall on a number of occasions, and in major areas such as the financing by Clark, McGuire unwillingly supports Butler. There is a hard core of plausibility to the Butler story. There is some possibility of exaggeration, perhaps not untypical for a man of Butler's flamboyant personality, but this is neither proven nor disproven. Without question, the Congress of the United States did a grave disservice to the cause of freedom in suppressing the Butler story. Let us hope that some congressman or some congressional committee, even at this late date, will pick up the threads and release the full uncensored testimony, and that's the end of the sentence. We may also hope that the next time around, in some comparably important matter, the New York Times will live up to its claim to be the newspaper of record, a name it justified so admirably 4 decades later in the Watergate investigation. And that's the end of chapter 10. If Sutton were alive today, I don't know that he would still support that statement of optimism, because the Times and the Post, the Washington Post or whatever, the whole bit about Watergate was also a mind-op. and the stories were fed to Woodward and Bernstein. And the purpose was eventually to remove Nixon from office without assassination. Because as John Coleman said, and I believe it to be true, that some bungled petty burglary should not have caused the downfall of a president. So, all right, there you have it. We're going to end this part 2. And you have to ask yourselves, what was at stake here? What was the purpose? But I do have to laugh, so to speak, because in trying to supposedly install and fail to install Roosevelt as dictator or somebody else, they got the dictator. I mean, this is what we talked about with executive orders, and people go, oh, the Constitution allows for that. And again, like I said, there are no rights that are given to citizens. And the Constitution doesn't grant us anything. We get privileges. So a lot of people ask, well, why do they allow executive orders? Because you can turn it into a dictatorship anytime you want to. And I think Roosevelt to this day leads the league in all-time executive orders written. And of course, that's because of the circumstances at the time, but that's understood. The handlers create the circumstances, and then they come out with the solution, which was the socialization of the United States with the programs that were created, some of them which were supposed to expire and never did, like Social Security. So something was afoot. I would think people would realize that Butler was not going to get involved with this, that he was acting pretty much like a double agent, and that there was a benefit to this. I think Butler may have been an unwitting pawn, because even if he blew the whistle, obviously it didn't get anybody in trouble. So whoever the handlers were, or I think they've been named here clearly, that they weren't about to get in trouble because they ran the show. So he could say whatever he wanted to or what was true, and he did, and it was ignored. It was ignored away. Well, anyway, we'll end it right there. That's part 2. We're certainly going to go to a part 3. Not sure if I'm completely finished with this Sutton book, moving on to Hans Schmidt's Maverick Marine. Thanks for being with us. This is Think or Be Eaten.